Welcome to The Change Lead, the podcast providing leaders with the insight needed to get things done in a rapidly changing and complex world. Subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. Connect with our community of like-minded leaders on our website, thechangelead.com. Welcome to The Change Lead with your host, Babatope Ipiyemi.
In our rapidly changing world, organizations are compelled to adapt, adjust, and transform. However, many of the well-intended change initiatives organizations choose to embark on end up struggling to create value. Today's guest is looking to change this. Brendon Baker is on a mission to help leaders drive real value. Brendon is a best-selling author and the managing director of Valuable Change Co. Today, Brendon and I will have a conversation about leading valuable change. Hi, Brendon. Thank you very much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation and welcome to today's show.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you for having me.
Perfect. So today we'll be talking about leading valuable change. And I think before we get stuck in, it would probably be a good idea to just take a step back and look at change leadership more broadly. So just to start with, probably a very simple question. How would you describe change leadership?
So change leadership is really the ability to drive holistically. Look, I'm really passionate about change and change leadership and change organizations. And something that I've noticed throughout my entire career was that majority of changes fail. Majority of changes fail because the leadership isn't supported, right? So the industry has essentially abandoned them. You've got project managers who are really good at driving straight into the what and the delving and driving through that. You've got the change managers and stakeholder managers who are really good at the who. You've got benefits managers who are really good at the metrics and whatnot that underpin it. But each of those professions are all deep and narrow. Change leadership is the ability to drive a change holistically without having to get into that depth, without having to get really narrow into one of those lines, but drive across people, purpose, and process and connect them and be able to push that forward, ultimately driving what I call valuable change, which is change that actually pays off, change that actually gives you what you want out of it.
Nice. That's a very good definition there. So if I probably break it down very simply, you effectively is the holistic synthesis of what you refer to as project management, benefit management, and stakeholder management. Look at it holistically. I think that is key, and that holistic approach makes a big difference. I think from experience as well, I can say I can testify to that as well. So if we go into leading valuable change, I like the term you used just there, change that pays off. We don't want change that just adds no value, change that actually does pay off, leading valuable change. So I like to start with, there's this saying, it's attributed to Levi Strauss. You might know it. It says, a wise man doesn't give the right answer, he poses the right question. So if change leaders choose to be wise, if leaders choose to be wise, how can be? What is the right question to ask, or let's say the right first question to ask when it comes to leading valuable change?
I think you're really hitting the nail on the head here, and I think it's probably because you've read my book, right? So that's a lovely little layup for me to hit. But you're right. So I mean, if you're a change leader, what you need to start with is asking the right questions. And the questions that I typically see asked are questions like, how long is this going to take, and how much is it going to cost me? Those are the two most common questions. Then normally followed by, okay, well, what staff do you need, right? That's where most people start. But you start there and you're shooting yourself in the foot. But what you need to be focusing on as a change leader is taking a couple steps back and building what I call a strong change core. Now, a strong change core is made up of the three valuable questions. The first of which is, why are we doing this? This whole idea behind starting with why, Simon Sinek and a few other people, and it's kind of perforating through, but in all honesty, a change that starts with why, it's a change that is slimmer, more streamlined, and more effective. So you need to be asking, why are we doing this, and getting that clear first. Then you move to the second valuable question, which is, and how will we prove it? So we're still not jumping into the what. We're still not jumping into the pricing and the delivery and the scoping and whatnot. It's, why are we doing this and how will we prove it? And we're looking to really get a picture of, what does success look like for us here? And when we're clear on those two things, then we move into, and what exactly are we doing? And in that is the scoping and the costing and the people and all of those things that come, that we're also familiar with. But it's really about taking those two steps back and connecting that through. In fact, an activity that I often do with my clients is something called a valuable question map. And it's insanely easy. It's a half an hour activity where what you do is you essentially draw three columns. You put them on a A3 piece of paper or a whiteboard. And the first column is why, the middle column is proof, and the third column is what. And you just draw boxes on there and you connect them in. And what that allows you to do is essentially catch yourself when you're putting things in the wrong boxes, or the wrong boxes in the wrong columns, more likely. And it's funny, sometimes I'm asked, what's the most common mistake people make when setting up, starting one of these kind of change initiatives. And basically defining your what as your why is probably the first mistake that people make. Instead of looking at, why do we need to do this, they essentially go, well, why do we do this? Oh, we need to do this because we need a new database, or we need to do this because we need X, Y, Z. Essentially grabbing that what element and just throwing that into the why column. So put them on a piece of paper, draw it up and ask yourself those questions. Why are we doing this? And if your answer is, well, we need a new database, okay, pop that in the what column and ask yourself again, well, why do we need a new database? Why are we doing this? And keep delving through until you actually get a useful why. Now, ideally, your why should be emotive and jargon-free, and there's a couple other components in there, but really what you want to get a feeling of is clarity. You really want to be clear on, why are we doing this? Then how are we going to prove it? Then link that through to what. And doing half an hour, doing that kind of exercise and answering those questions and getting the people in the room with you, number one, you're getting that initial buy-in. But number two, you're already starting to eliminate scope creep and ego components, which are essentially those things that are being done just because someone wants them to be done and not because they need to be. And you're eliminating a few other things. You're streamlining your change before you even, type a line of code or pick up a pencil or move a person, right? You're starting that streamlining activity really, really quickly and easily and immediately. So I guess to bring it back, a change leader needs to be asking the right questions, and those right questions are, why are we doing this? How will we prove it? And then what exactly are we doing?
Perfect. Very, very good, valid questions. I like that. Start with why. Why are we doing this? How are we going to prove it? Which is a question that sometimes never gets asked. And then what are we doing? I think the way you describe that reminds me of an experience I had. Now, I'll be vague, so I won't identify the actual organization, where there was a massive change initiative in flight, and in the middle of that, there was a change of leadership. And the new leadership came in, and the questions that were being asked there were three questions. How much is it going to cost to finish this? When will it be done? And how much will I get from it being done? All right. So,
yeah.
And I don't think they were quite wrong questions to ask, but they were the wrong questions at the time. And I remember at the time very clearly. This is something I said to anybody that could listen. We're asking the wrong questions here. It almost doesn't really matter what the answers are unless you understand the drivers, the motivations. You got new leadership as well. It's a new strategy. You're asking the wrong questions. And because of the size of the initiative, it actually took months to answer the question. And the decision was made on the back of that had no correlation with the answers to those questions. So it goes back to your point there, whereby you really do need to be starting with why. Why are we doing this? How do you prove it? So you can always tie that back and always have a validation as you go along the journey. Because sometimes these are long journeys as well before you get to the what. If I stick with that scenario I just described, and it's a challenge a lot of leaders face, where they are effectively stuck in the middle of a change initiative. Right? They are going through a change that it's not proving its worth. It's not adding value. It's not a valuable change. And they are faced with a very difficult decision. You either stick to your course and complete the change, or you write off sunk costs. Sometimes these sunk costs are in the millions, sometimes in the tens of millions. So it's easy to stand back and say, just make a call. They are tough decisions to make. It would be good to get your take on how would you advise leaders in that situation who are effectively stuck? Do you write off these sunk costs, or do you keep on?
So my thoughts are, first of all, that decision is one that I've seen change leaders faced with many times. It is probably the hardest decision to make when it comes to change initiatives. And it is the one that more often than not, change leaders will get wrong. They will more often than not, the sunk cost fallacy is very real. And more often than not, an expensive nothing is better than an expensive half-delivered nothing, apparently, right? So that tends to be the preference in that space with people. So my advice in that for anyone who is leading a change is do everything you can to avoid being in that position, because that is one of the hardest decisions that any change leader is going to face. Because it means pulling apart change teams. It means dropping contracts early. It means dropping all of this stuff that people have planned around, and the associated reputational hits, right? So whether or not people do it or not, whether or not I advise people to do it or not, people don't tend to accept the idea that it's a sunk cost. People will tend to more than often drive it through. So my advice is, avoid being in that situation as much as possible. But even if you are in that situation, my advice is still the same. What you need to be doing is dialing in and having another look at those three questions. Now, those three questions aren't just useful when you start a change. Those three questions should be, I call them a core, I call them your core. I don't call them your starting point or your starting line. Like, they are the core of your change. And so they don't disappear when you start driving your change and start delivering it and start making it reality. In fact, they become more important. And so they all evolve. They all essentially have evolutions. So the first one, why are we doing this? That as soon as you start moving forward with it, that evolves. And that becomes, is the why still valid? Right? And so the focus shifts from understanding the why to validating the why, right? And I mean, you just mentioned that, how do we keep this valid? And that should be something that you're monitoring as you're moving forward. We're all obsessed with, it probably comes down to, we start with how much is it going to cost and how long is it going to take me? And it seems like they're the only things that we monitor as we're delivering as well, right? Are we tracking to cost? Are we tracking to time, which are part of the conversation? But they're not the entirety of the conversation, nor are they the crucial aspect of the conversation. And so your why ideally should be being validated all the way throughout. But even if it hasn't, if you're, let's say you inherited a project that was on the rails, that was on the cliff face, that was almost about to fall over, and you are facing a decision like this, the first thing would be go and understand the why, and then go and validate it, and go and make sure that the context hasn't changed. Is this change still appropriate? Is this change still needed? Go and get the answer for that. Then move to the second one, which is how will we prove this, right? And that evolves to what do the early indicators say? Ideally, we should be seeing early indicators, some trends, looking in terms of, are we actually achieving the impact that we anticipated that we are going to achieve? And so that's the next lever point in terms of, okay, is there a pivot needed? Is there something, in terms of the change that's needed to be altered? The third element there is, the third question is, what exactly are we doing? And that evolves into, are we progressing as expected? And that's the space that we're all quite comfortable with. Project status reporting, all of that stuff. We're all very comfortable in that space. But it's spending time in those first two, those right questions. Ideally, if you're spending time on them every month, every quarter, however, whatever feels appropriate for the change, depending on the size of the change, you should be avoiding ending up in that position. First of all, you should be avoiding ending up in that sunk costs versus failure versus reputation versus all of that. You should be avoiding that decision as much as possible. But if you are, you need to go back and answer those questions. Is the why still valid? What are the early indicators say? And are we progressing as expected? And once you answer those three, then you have the data that you need to make the call. Now, it's only really the first question. If you find that the why is no longer valid, that's really the stop project call. This no longer makes sense. This change is no longer valid. We should not be putting any more money into this. We should not be putting any more time into this. And it's an easier decision to make. Still a hard one, but easier because you have some data on your side there. Now, the other two, what are the early indicators saying? And are we progressing as expected? It's those two that aren't necessarily worth killing a project over, but you may have to pivot. You may have to pause. You may have to take another look, but it doesn't mean that you have to kill it. And so my advice here is have a look at those three questions, at the evolution of them, update them, validate them. If the why is undermined and there is no point moving forward, then kill it. Accept the costs, move on. If it's around the impact that you're having or just the way that the project is running in terms of cost and time and whatnot, then you need to pivot, you need to tighten, you need to change the way that it's running, but it's not necessarily a death sentence for it.
I think that's very valid advice. And just the way you described it there, I can see how that can help many situations I've seen leaders in. This is really a leadership call. The way you've described it is a very good tool for change practitioners to be able to speak to leadership, speak to people who actually own the budget, to make those calls in a very sensible way. So thanks for sharing that. I want to touch you because the way you describe that shows that you've got a lot of experience, as in you've seen a lot of change. It's the only way you could speak to that, the way you've spoken to that. A few years ago now, quite a few years ago, when I finished my first large program of work that was running to millions in budget, one of my stakeholders asked me a very good question, and I still remember today. He said, "What have you learned from this process?" It's a simple question, but it's a very, very, very powerful question because of the way I answered it without really thinking about it. Because the project, we succeeded, we hit our objectives, but it was extremely painful. Like, it was extremely hard to keep everything on track. And what I said without thinking was, if only I knew then what I know now. And that response, I said it, but I chose to remember it because I know how impactful it is you almost need the learnings of the end of the program being available at the beginning, right? It's you need to know now what you would really know then, right? So you need to be aware now of what only the future can bring. So it just shows the importance of learning. That was the first thing. You've gone through this massive program of work. Really, you need to learn. And you need to learn not just from your own experiences, but from other people's experiences. So it would be good to get your take on how can, to provide valuable change, to lead valuable change, How can we embed learning in that process? What's your take on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. You mentioned the idea of, if only I knew then what I knew now. It's the old, the youth is wasted on the youth, or I'm always amazed how dumb I was just 2 weeks ago, right? It's that whole idea of, wow, I've learned so much. But it's always almost too late, especially when it comes to change, especially traditional. Like most people are delivering via agile and whatnot, which incorporates a degree of more frequent learning into it. But I mean, the more traditional waterfall style delivery, the learning is always just tacked on the end. Something that always amazed me. And so I guess my approach to learning is one that is multifaceted. But number one, it needs to be embedded. Number two, it needs to be collaborative. And number three, ideally, it's story driven. But the art here is, how do you actually achieve those things? And so I'm going to offer three things that, as a change leader, you need to have in place. First of all, the one is the right frame or the right mindset. This idea that logging a lesson is somehow good enough is not good enough, frankly. A lesson logged, i.e. the act of writing a lesson down, does not mean that you've learnt it, does not mean a thing. It means that you've written something on a piece of paper, and that's all that it means, right? A lesson logged is not a lesson learned. A lesson learned is a lesson learned. Like that's, it is what it is. So lesson requires this degree of a proof loop, right? Where essentially you need to be able to prove and show that you've learned a lesson to actually go, yes, we're learning. It needs that degree of a feedback loop, proof loop, something in that place. So that's a mindset shift. This whole idea of running an arbitrary lesson learned workshop and then putting them on a register somewhere and hiding them in a project report and then dumping them in a digital file for it never to be looked at again, that's not searchable, that's not lessons, that's just administration. Learning is something that we do together, right? And so it needs to have that proof and that feedback loop. That's your first one. That's a mindset change. The second element that you need to have in place is one of the right context. And this is, you need to be investing in it. And when I say investing, I don't necessarily mean money, although there's a money component. What I mean is in time. You need to be making the time. So for example, if I asked you, Baba Tope, give me the top 3 lessons that you've learned over the last 2 years, and I'm giving you 5 seconds to do it. Go. 1, 2, quick, you got 3 seconds.
You asked me to.
Yeah, the top 3 lessons over the last 2 years. You've got 2 seconds left.
I would say leadership counts for most things. I'll talk about influence.
Yeah, so but you're out of time. Sorry, that's it. You only had 5 seconds, all right? Perfect. So we got half a lesson in there, right? And so this is the thing, is if you don't make time for it, it's not going to happen. And our conversation would be very different if I gave you 10 minutes just then, or if I gave you an hour and you and I actually worked through it, right? Very, very different conversation. But something like 5 seconds, or normally it's 0 seconds, normally it's just run. It's not going to happen. And it's almost like we run to the finish line. We get to the finish line and go, oh, okay, deep breath. All right, what did we learn, right? And I mean, even the example that you gave at the beginning of this question was, we sat down at the end and what did you learn? And because we all have this moment to exhale at the end of a project or a change and essentially go, okay, all right, what did we learn from that? But that's the wrong time to be doing it, because you've already delivered, it's done. Like you're not incorporating the learnings as you go. So the idea is that, and this is one around embedding. You need to make the time for it. You need to make the space for it, and you need to plan that up front. So, if it means that everything's pushed ever so slightly, or perhaps one scope item doesn't get delivered, or however you want to be slicing it up, you need to make the time for it. that's something that, I don't tend to delve too deep into delivery methods and whatnot, but, that's something that Agile tends to explore a fair bit better than Waterfall, for example, is it tends to encourage that kind of retrospective, kind of reflective thinking on an ongoing basis, which is fantastic. And I think that's really the principle that we need to be pulling from it, is this idea of ongoing reflection and ongoing learning, making the time for it. The final element here, so we've talked about collaborative, needs to be a proof and feedback element. We talked about embedded, you need to make the time for it. The final element is story driven. And that kind of leads and links to the other two as well. And this is about having the right conversations. And so I know that I'm not the only person that has sat in those lessons learned review sessions and been bored out of their absolute mind, right? Maybe that's blasphemy, but I don't care. Is that they are the play out one of two ways. You get everyone together and you ask everyone, oh, what went well and what didn't go well? And, how could we have managed our costs better? How could we have managed our time better? How could we have managed our stakeholder management better, right? It's always the same set of questions and it's always the same kinds of answers. And the sessions tend to run as it's overwhelmingly positive because someone is just trying to create a positive spin on what happened on the reality, creating some propaganda, or it's an overwhelmingly negative spin where people just essentially just whinge the whole session, right? And sometimes it's a blend of both, but overall, it's not fruitful. And I think that's really the crux of it. So, I mean, if you look at how we as humans learn, we've been telling stories and learning through stories for longer than we've been writing, for longer than we've been doing anything. So we need to be capitalizing on that fundamental human element and that fundamental human trait where we need to be leveraging story as part of our learning conversations. We don't want to be asking arbitrary questions like what went well and what didn't go well and whatnot. What we need to be doing is asking people to tell the story. And I mean, there's a really simple method I tend to use for that. And I don't claim credit for this, but it works really well, is you draw a horizontal line on a whiteboard or virtual or whatnot. And then everything above the line is a positive plot point and everything below the line is a negative plot point. And you essentially go around the room and you ask people to tell the story of the last fortnight, the last month, whatnot. And you start at the beginning. Okay, what happened and what happened? And you're essentially building an interactive, collaborative plot line. And from that, you then start to find trends and patterns and similarities. And you start to essentially draw out insight from the story that's now being collaboratively built on the board. And people will start to see that. They'll start to see, oh, yeah, I also had that. And, in my workshops, I tend to run these in terms of tell me about the last, your morning. How did your morning start? We woke up. Okay, what was after that? Oh, we had some coffee. We had some breakfast. They had to get the kids to school, right? All of these elements. And these are the plot points. And what's interesting is the way that people put them. Oh, we ran late, couldn't get parking. And all of these other dynamic elements start to come out on something as simple as getting to work that morning. And already, because what you then start to pull out two key learnings, right? And if you can pull two key learnings out of a collaborative plot line of someone's trip to work, you can absolutely pull out two key learnings from someone's 2 weeks driving a change. And I say two key learnings because that's essentially all that you need. You don't want to be creating big, long lesson logs and whatnot here, because the whole idea is that this is embedded and ongoing. It's not something at the end. It is a reflection that's in it at the time and being immediately useful. And we don't have the attention span to concentrate on any more than 3. So limit it at 3, keep it to 1 or 2, and then, maximum 3. And that's the focus, those lessons, those learnings, that trend, whatever it was that pops out through that session, that's the focus for the next fortnight. We will improve in X, Y, Z. and make that the focus, make that more obvious, put it on a board somewhere, put it, reiterate it in the meetings, whatever you want to do, but make it front of mind. And so that way you're building in that learning loop. And then when you next get a chance to reflect, ask yourselves, did we achieve it? How can we prove that we achieved it? What's our anecdotal evidence? Okay, we're starting to actually see progress in that space. That's a lesson learned. Let's start to move forward, right? And that brings it all together. That's the whole idea of it's collaborative. There are feedback loops in place. It's embedded. And ultimately, you're using story to draw it out. You're having those right conversations. That's how I approach learning, because that's how we as humans learn.
I think you describe it perfectly there. I think it's a very unique process you've used there. I've used something slightly different to embed, as I won't go into it, slightly different, but I like the notion of using stories there and making sure it's iterative, it's an ongoing process. One thing I've noticed when I've done that, I call it a process improvement process. So that because it's ongoing, it's not something that happens at the end, beginning, or start of a project. It's something that it's an ongoing piece of work. Is when you have a team working together, which a project team coming together, they come together, you have the embedded embedded learning and an ongoing process of improvement. However, with a lot of organizations, the project teams keep being put together and literally destroyed. It's quite hard to maintain that learning. And I think it speaks to the environment in which a lot of change takes place. Sometimes the environment in which the change takes place is probably the biggest determinant of its success or failure. When you have that much organizational teams being disbanded and being rejoined, being relocated, and reverse relocations going on all the time, it does create a different kind of challenge. So I want to get your take on the environment and the context in which change is actually taking place. What is it that we can do to foster an environment in which we can deliver valuable change that actually pays off?
Yeah, I really like that. And so the environment is crucial, and you're spot on in terms of change is an environment that is inherently, I guess there's always change within the change environment, right? Is probably the best way to put that. And it is, there are short-term it's temporary staffing arrangements, it's temporary it's by its very nature, it's temporary, but it has its own little breaks in between. So as a change leader, what do you need to keep in mind, and what kind of environment do you need to foster? Now, what I tend to advise here is that we need to be working towards a culture of openness. Now, a culture of openness is one that essentially allows your people to do three things. Number one, they need to be comfortable to fail, and they need to feel safe enough to fail. Number two, they need to be comfortable to succeed and feel safe enough to succeed. And number three, they need to be comfortable and feel safe enough to reflect and be honest. Now, those are the three components that we really need to be fostering within our changes. Because when you create a space where all three of those elements are in place, you create this open culture. And this open culture is one that ultimately enables that right type of learning, that right type of progression, that right type of, really it is progression. And it's progression in terms of both a personal point of view, because people are able to move forward themselves personally, as well as for the organization, because they're showing up and they're giving their best, and they are essentially giving their best ideas rather than holding them back. And on top of that, you're essentially neutralizing what I call the deadly 7 fears. And I won't list them all off because, I'm sure we've got a time limit for this chat, but there's a few in there, right? One that's particularly pertinent in my home country, Australia, is this idea of a tall poppy syndrome, where you don't want to stand too tall for fear of being cut down. And it is culturally pervasive here. It absolutely is. Whether it's our convict heritage or whether it's something else, I'm not sure, but it is culturally pervasive here. This whole idea of everyone gets a fair shot, but you don't want to stand too tall. But there's other fears in place as well. And so, I mean, that fear contributes to a fear of success. But there's other fears, fear of embarrassment, fear of it's being taken advantage of. Those types of things tend to create a fear of failure. And so how do we create that? How do we create this culture of openness? And I tend to do so using rituals. So we've already talked about reflection. We've already talked about learning. And we've already talked about what we need to try to do in there and how do we embed it and collaborate and whatnot. But what about the other two? What about success and failure? How do we make those things okay? So a lot of people talk about accepting failure. A lot of people talk about accepting failure. Not many people talk about accepting success, which is interesting. Now, failure is one of those things that if you actually have management that is, and as a leader, if you are leading in such a way that you do accept that your people are going to fall short, that's the first step. You need to accept that they are going to fall short. You need to accept that they will fail, and you need to be okay with that. That's a mental hurdle and a personal hurdle that you need to get over, because you yourself know that you don't always hit your goals and achieve everything you turn up to. So why in the hell should they, right? So you need to accept that. And then you need to help them feel comfortable expressing and learning from that. And something that I use in that space, it's very simple. I mean, you could use your own methods, but something that I use is something called a failure session. Now, a failure session is really, really simple, where it's you get the team together and you essentially go through and say, what was everyone's biggest failure for the week? Quite overtly, very directly, what was everyone's biggest failure? And you need to kick it off, right? And you need to be vulnerable and do so. And you go, all right, this is how I failed this week. And, pop it up, share a little 30-second story with it, provide a little bit of context, but be open with your failure. And then encourage everyone else to share. And what you'll find is the majority of them will not share vulnerable failures. The majority of them will not do that on the first session, or the second, or the fourth. But after about 10, 12 sessions, that vulnerability will be there. It'll start one and then another, and eventually it'll start to seed through, and you'll be having these open discussions, knowing that they can be vulnerable about the failure, and they will be receiving support, not penalty. And that's how you start to create a culture of openness, is you bring that failure into the open and you encourage a team that's full of support. Right. That's failure. But there's other methods. I've seen other organizations run, there's this concept of the wooden spoon here in our rugby league, Australian here. And the wooden spoon is essentially the team that comes last. All right, the team that wins gets the trophies and the cups and all of those things, but the team that comes last gets the wooden spoon. And that's an idea that has come through into some organizations here is, what's the best project idea that failed, right? Like, what's our biggest failure for the year? And they're, including that in their yearly awards ceremonies and whatnot, and celebrating the ambition and the willingness to fail and experiment and put yourselves out there, even though it didn't happen, it didn't work, and that's okay, because that's life and that's reality, right? So there's ways to do it, but failure sessions is the way that I tend to do it, because it's more intimate and it enables you to start to build that support within your team. Interestingly, I use a very similar strategy to help encourage success. So fear of success is something, and a willingness to succeed is something that not a lot of people talk about. It tends to be one of those things that we just assume that people want to succeed. But I've spoken to enough people to know that that's not necessarily the case. Many people in your team are hiding what they can do or are thinking or whatnot, because they are wanting to meet the cultural norms, because they don't want to look too big, because they actually don't want to get promoted. People are happy where they are. They don't want to get promoted, but maybe they do have a good idea, right? So how do you start to bring that out? How do you make success more overt? And how do you make that okay? And to be honest, I use the exact same method because it's simple and it works to bring out success and bring out that openness for success. And there are sessions that I call blow your own horn sessions, where essentially instead of going around the room and you talk about failures, you go around the room and you talk about what's your biggest success for the week. And you spend 30 seconds going through context and whatnot, and everyone celebrates that success with you. And these aren't necessarily big mind-bending successes. Sometimes they are, because occasionally we hit the milestones and whatnot, and there are those weeks where everything goes right. But more often than not, they're smaller successes. They're simpler. And so that's essentially what you do. You start to bring it out and you make it celebrated and you encourage that discussion. I mean, I'll give you a little example here. Is there was a junior project manager that I was coaching. And in fact, there's one that I'm currently coaching, another one that she's a business manager. They're basically both suffering from this same fear of success. Everyone around them could see their skill. Everyone around them could see their potential, but they couldn't see it. They couldn't see the fact that they were kicking ass. They couldn't see the fact that they were, just moving quickly. And that confidence level wasn't there. They that fear of success was very real for them. And on the first one, I incorporated these success sessions, or blow your own horn sessions, right? I started doing that. And within a month and a half, she started talking more overtly about her success. She started being more vulnerable with it. And initially, we'd go to these sessions and we go, oh no, I haven't achieved anything this week. And we would have to fill in her ticket for her. We'd say, no, I saw you do X, Y, Z, right? And you essentially, you help them see it. And it's just, as a leader, you need to be doing that, helping your team see the way they are succeeding. And as you build that awesome openness. And you essentially then start to build those confidence levels. And to be honest, with that junior project manager I was coaching there, I love this example because in that first session, she honestly had no answer. By the end of those sessions that I had with her, she was rocking and rolling. This is what I achieved this week. Bang, bang, bang. A month later, she was promoted to senior project manager, and off she went. Bigger projects, bigger successes, more money, right? I love that. Absolutely love that story. And that's the power of this, right? You need to build that confidence within your teams. So I guess bring it all back here. It's all about a culture of openness. That's the environment we want to be fostering. Whether it's virtual, whether it's in person, it doesn't really matter, because there are strategies you can use to draw people out. And you want to be making people okay and creating a culture that is okay with failing, with succeeding, and with reflecting. And if you achieve that, then you're achieving so much more.
So you really want to be creating a culture of openness. I think I like the way you describe that. It's interesting you brought out the cultural nuances there, because certain challenges or certain mindsets are predominant in certain areas. I had a previous guest on. He was talking about a mindset whereby people believe you need to succeed first time. It goes back to your fear of failure. This is the mindset that you're trying to do something brand new, and it's just going to work first time, which is not reality, but that's the bias. It's probably more of an American focused mindset, but that is a very predominant mindset that you see, and it's very popular in culture as well. So I like the way, and the fact that I like the way you described it, and the fact that you can use rituals to begin to address that and embed the right environment, embed the right open culture is quite key there. In terms of an environment, I think sometimes the biggest determinant of the environment in an organization is people at the top of the organization, the leaders. One of my previous guests on the podcast, he made a statement that he said, and in regards to change and how do you deliver change, he said, it starts at the top. All right, and a lot of this starts at the top. We need the people at the top of the organization, leaders, and not just the leaders at the top of the organization, but influencers, people who are within the organization, but who have that lateral influence to be driving forward the right environment, the right cultures. Every exec I know would say they want a valuable change. They want a good return of investment on their change initiative. So if we speak super directly to execs now, super directly to the people at the top of the organization, what advice would you give them very directly to drive valuable change?
My advice is think holistically. You need to think holistically. Valuable change. So think holistically and question the way that you're defining success. Because a valuable change is not necessarily the one that delivers on time and on budget. That doesn't prove that your change has paid off in any way. That just proves that you've spent money and spent time doing something and you hit your plan. That's all that proves. A valuable change is one that pays off. So think very carefully and think holistically about how you define your own success for your change. And I mean, that's why I like those three valuable questions. Why are we doing this? How will we prove it? And then what are we doing? And in that order, because it's in the first two that you find success, not the third. The third is the mechanics of valuable change. It's the mechanics of change. The first two is where the value sits. So if you want to maximize your value, if you want to maximize your ROI, spend time answering those two questions and regularly check up on them and monitor them. That's the biggest piece. It's a mindset shift. Think holistically, connect purpose with people, with process, but ultimately spend time on your why and spend time on your proof and allocate that time and priority to it throughout. You do that, and you'll see massive improvements in your ROI. I mean, to be honest, I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation around connecting these three valuable questions up, doing it on a board. Now, if you're doing that on a board and you're stripping out scope items because you can now clearly see what things are not going to contribute to your why, you're effectively potentially doubling your ROI anyway, because you're stripping out things that you otherwise would have done that you no longer have to do. And that's the advantage of actually focusing on the value of what you're doing and not just the mechanics of what you're doing. So my advice is challenge the way you define success. Valuable change is not one that delivers on time and on budget. Valuable change is one that gives you what you're actually looking for.
Perfect. I think we're really almost out of time. It's been a very brilliant conversation. You've provided a lot of insights, generously shared a lot of what you've learned. It would be good before we close for you to share, what are you doing right now? Anything about yourself you want to share with everybody, and obviously how people can reach you as well.
So look, I work in partnership with clients, within Australia, but I take international clients as well. And essentially, I help my clients do two things. Number one, I help them drive more valuable change. Probably no surprises there based on this discussion. But number two is I help them foster change leadership within their own organizations, because I'm not into codependent relationships. The other thing, so I guess if there's anything you heard, feel free to reach out. I often say that I'm just an email away, and that's the honest truth. I am honestly just an email away. You can get in touch with me. My website is valuablechange.com. I'm on LinkedIn. You'll be able to find me there. Otherwise, my books, Valuable Change and Creating High Value PMOs, are available everywhere you should expect to buy a book. If it's not, then look somewhere else. It'll be there. Paperback, and also an audiobook now as well. Both of them are on audiobook. So however you want to consume these, go for it. If you can't find it, for whatever reason, reach out. I've also got a weekly newsletter, the Change Leader Weekly. Readership is rapidly growing on that, which I'm very pleased by, but it also means that there's value there. So have a check in there as well, because what I'm seeing, and I mean, I'm very biased and I'm openly biased on this, but what I'm seeing is that readership is increasing, and I'm not getting all that many unsubscribes, if I'm honest. So I think there's some value there. So look, valuablechange.com, reach out. Happy to hear from you. I'm honestly just an email away, and no question is too stupid.
Thanks, Brendon. What I'll do is I'll put your details in the show notes. So description section for those looking at the YouTube, or if you're on any of the podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere you listen to your podcasts, you'll find that in the description. Brendon, thank you so much for your time. We'll definitely be in touch. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Would you like to learn more about leading valuable change? Would you like to join in the conversation about change that pays off? Connect with a community of like-minded leaders on our website, thechangelead.com. When you visit our site, click Join to join the community. Check out the show notes for details on how you can contact today's guest, Brendon. Also, please don't forget to like, comment, review, and subscribe. Thank you very much for tuning in. Have a great week, and see you next time.